And next up, we have Maddie Schrader.
Hi, I'm Maddie Schrader. I actually don't have slides either. My talk is called Working with MARC, an Outsider's Perspective. Like I said, I'm Maddie Schrader. I wrote a open source MARC editing suite called C# MARC Editor, and I wrote it not knowing anything about libraries or MARC records or bibliography records or anything similar, pretty much from the ground up. I've always been a self-learner, so the first thing I did was Google what is a MARC record. And a couple sources came up that were extremely useful. The first was the Library of Congress MARC 21 documentation. The second was the Working with MARC Wikipedia page, or wiki page for Code4Lib, which was phenomenal. And lastly, my coworkers had a giant book about AACR2 that was probably about this thick, and I think I read 3 or 4 pages of it. It was a little daunting. But the first thing I found out was that MARC records there wasn't a way to work with MARC records in my chosen programming language, which is C#. So the first thing I did was figure out how to read a MARC record, which thankfully Code4Lib helped me with that. All of the linked class libraries gave me something to base my code on and work from there. And once I was able to read a single record in and write a single record out, I started getting into batch editing. And that was an interesting experiment, because the first thing I would do is read all the records in, do work on them, and then write them all back out. And that was great until I found out MARC record files are 700 megabytes or bigger. For example, the entire Library of Congress catalog is 9 gigabytes of raw MARC. So I ran out of memory really quickly. So I learned a new approach, which was open the file for reading, read a single record in, work on it, write a single record out, which was probably the thing I should have done to begin with, but you don't think about these kind of things all the time. And I did that for a long time, and I figured out there's got to be a better way to work with this format, because it was a thing I was doing all the time for my work. And what I ended up doing is I built a relational database in SQLite. And I wrote a script that would read in the MARC record, convert it to a relational database, and write it back out again when you're done working on it. So you could do everything in SQL, which was had a lot of benefits. First, it was read once and write once, so you don't have to think about doing everything in little pieces. You could test reading everything in and reproduce that, and test writing everything out and reproduce that, and didn't have to think about a lot of stuff. And you didn't have to rewrite all of my batch editing code each time I went to a new project or a new script I had to figure out. I didn't have to copy and paste anything. I didn't have to open up any libraries. I just opened up my tool, built the database, wrote some SQL, and exported it back out. It does have some downsides, though. It's much slower to set up the first time, so it's not great for one-off projects to do development this way. And it does require a lot more hard drive space. That 9 gigabyte Library of Congress catalog I was working with ended up being 26 gigabytes once it was in an SQLite database. But even then, SQLite surprisingly handled it without too much of a headache. So from there, that's kind of what is a good thing to figure out. I've been hearing all these great things about OpenRefine, but somebody told me today that not even that can handle any kind of huge amount of data. So there's always something new to learn and a new way of doing things. And as an outsider to the community, when I first came into the library industry, it was interesting to kind of take those steps from a unique perspective. Thank you very much.